a 10-second notice, you can go ahead and begin recording. And I'll wait to see the little recording button before I start. There it is. Okay, we're recording now. Call the meeting to order of the Conference Committee on House File 1952. Today being Saturday, May 15th, 2021. Welcome everybody. I'm glad you could be here today. This is a Zoom only. It is live streamed though for those who are wanting to watch it in that way. And I trust that even though we had a little technical as far as doing it, better to do it right away when nobody's really started their testimony phase yet, so we can have the strongest connection once we are started. So thank you all for that. And by the way, everybody was really fast. You really watched for your emails and Zoom. You all just came right back on. So that was great. Okay, with that, we're going to be talking in particular today about the SHPO sections. And that's the, for those who are maybe not familiar with some of our acronyms, that is the State Historical Preservation Office. And so we are going to go ahead and take testimony today. Out of respect for our commissioners that are here today, I'm going to have, we have Laura Lane is here from MMB available for questions. So we'll do that. So I'm going to go first to Commissioner Alice Roberts Davis, and also Julie Byrle of the Department of Administration is available for questions. So it sounds like, Commissioner, you're going to go ahead, and I'll just have you go first as a commissioner. Commissioner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members, my testimony this morning will be brief. I think that there are a lot of things in the SHPO language that we are neutral on or amenable to. I think our largest concern with this language is the transfer of the operation of sites, historical sites, from the Minnesota Historical Society to the Department of Administration, in large part because first, I'm not sure what the genesis of that transfer is. This is not something that the Department of Administration discussed prior to this bill with anyone. We weren't aware that that transfer was being contemplated. It's not something that we have within the Department of Administration and the SHPO the expertise to run. We are within the SHPO a regulatory body largely. We are largely federally funded, and our federal funds do not contemplate operating historical sites. And so with the staff of 13 people who are focused on preserving historical sites and managing tax credits and regulatory functions, operating sites is not something that we have the expertise to do. And this is a large portfolio. We believe that it is properly placed with the Minnesota Historical Society, and it should remain there. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Members, any questions for Commissioner Alice Roberts Davis? Okay, seeing none at this time. Next, I'll go to Mr. Kelleher and Mr. Kent Whitworth with Minnesota Historical Society. I'm not sure if you both want to testify or if one of you is going to start. Mr. Whitworth, you've gone off mute, so it looks like that indicates you're going to start. So Mr. Whitworth, go ahead. And again, members, I just always say this to remind you that state your name and the organization you represent for the audio record and for the people who may not have a video connection. Mr. Whitworth.
Thank you, Chair Kiffmeyer, Chair Nelson, members of the conference committee. My name is Kent Whitworth, and I serve as the director and CEO of the Minnesota Historical Society. I'll keep my remarks brief as well, but I want to join Commissioner Roberts Davis in expressing our desire to maintain the operations of Minnesota's state-owned historic sites. Frankly, we are proud of the track record of the Minnesota Historical Society managing these sites. We have welcomed millions of visitors. We have provided excellent care for more than 150 buildings in this site network. We have expertise in the area of historical interpretation, education, collections management, facilities care, fundraising, earned income, membership, even visitor evaluation. So we have capacity. We have built capacity around this important function. And I would remind the conference committee that we are an organization that has partnered with first the territory of Minnesota and then the state of Minnesota for generations. And our relationship with the state and this particular function is embedded in state statute. So we very much would like to retain the operations of the state-owned historic sites in Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whitworth. Members, any questions? Mr. Whitworth, I do have some questions for you in regards to, in particular, the land. So does the Minnesota Historical Society own the land that you manage?
I will also ask my colleague David Kelleher to join us, but the arrangements surrounding the various sites within our network is not consistent. It's quite complex, so it's going to depend on the particular site. But over the years, we have been able to manage the nuances, if you will, of those operating arrangements and the ownership of the property. So with that, I'll turn the question over to David. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whitworth. Mr. Kelleher.
Madam Chair, members of the conference committee, for the record, I'm David Kelleher, Minnesota Historical Society. Madam Chair, and members of the conference committee, there's actually an interesting history of how the Historic Sites Network developed, and each site has its own story of how the site needed to be preserved and how that site came into the Historic Sites Network. Some of those sites were donated directly to the Minnesota Historical Society. So in those cases, title is held by the Minnesota Historical Society. In some cases, the property was either donated or purchased by the state of Minnesota. And in those cases, title is held by the state of Minnesota. And in some ways, it's a bit of a patchwork on ownership, but really, when you look at the Historic Sites Network as it's set out in statute and as it's set out in practice, it is just that, a network. It's a grouping of sites that we operate and maintain and open to the public for their education and enjoyment. And as it's set out in statute, as a network, we like to operate it seamlessly. The ownership questions don't impact the daily visitors. They don't know if they're setting foot on a site that's owned by the Minnesota Historical Society or the state of Minnesota, but we operate them together.
Thank you, Mr. Kelleher. I have another question for you. Can you give me an example? Actually, I have a couple of them. Can you give me an example of a complex one? So what you mentioned, donated to the Minnesota Historical Society. And Mr. Kelleher, as I understand, you're a nonprofit, correct?
Madam Chair, a couple of questions in there. I'll take the second one first. We are a nonprofit. We are a 501c3 organization. And as Mr. Whitworth mentioned, we were formed by the territorial legislature in 1849, before statehood. And that was before there were nonprofits, before there were 501c3s. And since that time, we have been a partner with the state. We had residents in the current Capitol building when it opened in 1905. We had a library and a small museum and a collections area in the basement of the state capitol, where Senate Council and Research used to be, on that ground floor. which is now the East Hallway. That was our first home in the state capitol. After that, the state built what's now the Judicial Center. That was the Minnesota Historical Society building adjacent to the Capitol, built in 1917, 1918, where generations of people, myself included, did research in the library there. So we have been a partner with the state. We are a nonprofit, but that status as a nonprofit allows us to extend the reach of the work that we do beyond the resources that the state is able to put in. We have tens of thousands of members. Unfortunately, that number has shrunk a little bit during the pandemic, but we will grow it back. And those members join in and are part of the network. They love to visit historic sites and enjoy what we all have to offer there. We also have donors who, in many cases, put us in their will to continue the work that we do. So this partnership between the state of Minnesota and the Minnesota Historical Society allows us to extend the reach of the work that we do. This hybrid status also allows us, in some cases, as Kent mentioned, we are written into statute in several locations. And one of those is in the sections of statute that deal with bond funds. So we use state bond funds to do asset preservation projects to take care of the 150 buildings in the State Historic Sites Network. Those are historic buildings that take additional care. And so there's an interweaving of the work that we do with the state of Minnesota. And I think your first question was, Madam Chair, an example of mixed ownership. I'm trying to think of an example, but there may be some examples where a parcel of land was purchased with state funds. Let's see, maybe the fur post up in Pine City, I believe there were some parcels purchased with federal land and water conservation funds. Those would have come through the state. And I believe some other parcels in that site were purchased by the Minnesota Historical Society, I believe in the 1960s. So that would be an example of a hybrid where there's a little of both state and Minnesota Historical Society ownership.
Would Fort Snelling be another one of those?
Madam Chair, Fort Snelling title is held by the state of Minnesota.
In its entirety, Mr. Kelleher?
Madam Chair, yes.
Okay. So I think there's some issues that we found conveyance of lands. And do you also interact, Mr. Kelleher, with DNR in regards to some of these historical sites, Mr. Kelleher?
Madam Chair, yes. And there's also an interesting history of the sites that are adjacent to state parks and DNR land. So yes, we work very closely with DNR in those cases where we are adjacent to them. Couple of examples would be Split Rock Lighthouse and the Lindbergh historic site. Those are both adjacent to state parks. And when those parks came into state ownership in different ways, over time, the decision was made that the historic site part of it would go under the care and operation of the Minnesota Historical Society. So take Split Rock Lighthouse, for example. The lighthouse and the lighthouse keeper dwellings are maintained and operated for the thousands and thousands of visitors who probably are visiting today and enjoying a beautiful day outside. That's state-owned, but operated by the Minnesota Historical Society, where we use our expertise. That's a national historic landmark, and our facilities staff take good care of the lighthouse itself and the lighthouse keepers' dwellings. At the same time, there's a state park adjacent to that historic site, and we work closely with the park staff there to figure out, the logistics of management of people coming in to that site. And
sure. Okay.
okay.
So Mr. Kelleher, since one's in my backyard,
Yes.
I can't help but ask, what about the Oliver Kelly Farm and its
Madam
ownership?
Madam
Mr.
Chair,
Kelleher.
of course, that's a great example. And I have to say that as I stepped out this morning to let my dog out, I was remembering back to a beautiful day about 4 years ago when we all celebrated the opening of the new visitor center at the Oliver Kelly Farm. And that's a great example of a partnership between the state of Minnesota and the Minnesota Historical Society. The Oliver Kelly Farm was purchased by the Minnesota Historical Society and working with the Grange in the 1960s. So that's owned by the Minnesota Historical Society, but it's in the Historic Sites Network in statute. And as you well know, because you worked very diligently on the appropriation for the new visitor center, that's a really good example of how we can leverage additional resources to build a better facility, having partners, individuals, corporations, people from the ag sector, other citizens who contributed their resources to make that a better place for families and school kids. So that's a great example of the model that we use to operate these places and improve the capital facilities.
Thank you, Mr. Kelleher. I always thought, though, that there was, that the state owned the historic sites, and it never occurred to me that this was a different kind of arrangement, and also the conveyances of lands as well. And so that's become something just recently aware of that matter that is before us. And I think it is also the fact that when you have a nonprofit, things are run a little differently than a state agency, which you usually think of. And then I always thought of the Historical Society as a state agency and in that regard. And so that's just a few of the questions that I have at this time, Mr. Kelleher. And I always appreciate your knowledgeable answers, and I appreciate that very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mhm. And then we're going to go to Stephanie or Steph Chappell. I'm sorry if I have mispronounced your name. And welcome to the committee, Ms. Chappell. And if you can go ahead and give your testimony. You're still muted, yeah.
There we go.
There you go.
Thank you, everyone. My testimony today will focus on the ownership issues that I found when I've been doing research and working within my personal research regarding 2 sites and trying to work between the Historical Society and work around what I have found to be some difficult situations. I began researching back in 2017, and I found myself a little perplexed when I went to a state historic site and wanted to know a little bit more about Fort Snelling and the revitalization that was happening there. There was a open house sponsored by the National Park Service. And so I saw the clip in my newspaper and thought, let's go see what they're doing there. And when I got there, I was intrigued and wanted to know more information. When I got to the point, I realized that my information was inaccessible to me because the Historical Society is a nonprofit. I inquired about some different elements of the designs and was told I didn't have access to that. And I was wondering why. And I was told in a that the Historical Society is a nonprofit. And I went through 3 different emails over the course of 6 months and found out that indeed the information is not considered or deemed public information because the Historical Society is not what you consider a state agency, but rather a nonprofit. And the state agency shelter umbrella allows them to withhold information from any person, which I thought didn't seem right. The information I was asking for had to do with some different designs within the landscape, as they call it. I didn't understand then that it was a cultural landscape. I thought it had to do with trees and shrubs, but what I found out from researching is that it was more to do with the different cultures that inhabited the areas rather than trees and shrubs. So as I said, it took me some time to get that information. That information guided me in a different direction to ask even more questions. And I came up against the same brick wall, you might say. And after asking more questions, finally I was told, no, there's no information available to you. And I started to look deeper and found the SHPO offices and the State Historic Preservation offices. I was able to go there. They were very helpful. They had completely different rules, regulations of that nature. And you walked in, signed into a small book, and you were given free access to the information. It took me 2 years to find the information, meeting brick walls at the State Historical Society, and SHPO offices had it right there. And you were able, they were helpful. They directed you where you needed to go and just pulled it out from a file. And there it was. At SHPO offices, you are able to make copies. I'm technologically challenged, and they were helpful in explaining this is how you do it more than once. And I was able to get the information. I find it really difficult to understand why state records are not accessible to state employed or to state residents when you're a state resident for a state-owned property. It just boggles my mind that I, as a citizen of Minnesota, couldn't have access to that information. And it's just something that needs to change. And I think that by changing the policies, it will open some doors to other people to go and realize how much further our money goes and where the inconsistencies and the consistencies are within the finances of the State Historical Society, and also within the state budgets. I think there's a lot of give and take, and it's a win-win for both. I see that there's a lot of panic, I guess is the best word, regarding transfer of these sites, but it's really a paper situation that will give ownership back to the state and allow the citizens to access the information as they should be able to, without having all of the trouble or confusion that I went through. And as SHPO introduced in the beginning, they're not set up to manage sites. MNHS is set up to manage the sites. And they will be able to continue that. They will be able to separate themselves from the state and be able to focus on their interpretations and continue with interpretations as they want to. And I think that is very important. They generate their funds based on their interpretations and getting people to the sites. I think that is something that they will be able to do. And in return, they can also be able to fund themselves more, with more self-sustaining, trying to find the right word. With a better self-sufficiency rather than any dependence on the state. And that will be a win-win for them. And this state will have a win-win because we'll be able to better finance them and see them flourish. And at the same time, the state will be able to put their finances in another direction. And tourism is huge. So we'll be able to really make this a big tourism step for everyone.
Thank you, Ms. Chappell. You also had mentioned that in the process of having these conversations that there were others involved either with ownership or control having to do with federal and other entities. Could you explain how you came to know about some of these? Because you're kind of one of those people who just started asking one question and then it led to another and other pieces of information. So would you continue about how you went forward and found other entities being involved here through like maybe email things or things like that? Can you go there, Ms. Chappell?
Yes, thank you. I started by, like I said, attending the open house, and that was sponsored by the National Park Service. The Minnesota Historical Society was there, but they didn't have the answers that I was seeking. And instead, I decided to start researching on my own. And I found that there was information through the National Park Service and records and management that led me to the State Historic Preservation Office. And I thought, who's this? It was something new to me. I did not realize there was a State Historic Preservation Office. So I started looking more and getting some more information into that and reviewing it in more detail. And that's what led me to the State Historic Preservation Office, where I could actually look and find the information that I was seeking after being shut out from the Historical Society. One thing, so it's a historic structure, so therefore it needs to be with the Historical Society. And that's not necessarily true. The State Historical Society has information, but SHPO is the one who is the holder of all of the state's information. And they are responsible for maintaining all of the state historic site registries. It is not the Historical Society that does that. And that's something that I wasn't aware of. It does fall on the SHPO shoulders for that. So the Historical Society has, I think either David or Kent mentioned, they are charged with interpretation, but it is the state that has the duty to maintain the registers. And that's what I think is something special. The two work in tandem. However, with the state's responsibility, it really is something that the state needs to control for the state benefit and for the national benefit as well. So we're responsible ideally. It's not the Historical Society that's responsible.
Mhm. Okay, thank you very much. Is there anything else that you wanted to add?
Yes, I've been frustrated by the process in general. It's been a unique situation and has just an individual. It's been eye-opening to me to realize that it's just not what you would expect it to be. It's been frustrating to engage with the State Historical Society because you have this expectation that it is a state agency, and it's not. And I think that is something that is misunderstood with a lot of individuals. And it's really something that needs to go to a state ownership situation. And that way, the management can be done with the state for the state-owned historic sites, and the interpretation can be done with the Historical Society. And that will make it much easier. And then also trying to do the research on the historic sites was really difficult because they're all changed. They're not considered the same thing in statute that they are on the site. For example, the fur post that Dave referred to, it is called one thing by the Historical Society for branding purposes, but it is not called that in the statutes. I think the statutes are Northwest Fur Trading Post, and it's been changed by the Historical Society for another reason. And I think before anything else is done, that it gets corrected. So everyone realizes that, okay, we're talking about the same thing. And then it will make my work a lot easier rather than trying to figure out which is which. And that's just something at one point, there was another that I had to dig quite a bit for, and it was given an odd name. And finally I found it was part of a store in historic Forestville, I think it was. And that was tough. It was going back through a lot of information and some historic sites in order to find that. So thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Ms. Chappell. I would give an opportunity to Mr. Kelleher or Mr. Whitworth to just make any comments at this time. It looks like Mr. Kelleher is getting ready. Mr. Kelleher.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to respond to one thing that Ms. Chappell said. With the historic Fort Snelling revitalization project, that's a big construction project, and that's a project that is on a National Historic Landmark, which is the highest designation that the Department of the Interior gives to a historic place, and it's a former federal property. So the National Park Service, the Mississippi National River Recreation Area, MNRA, the local branch of the National Park Service, got involved, and that whole project underwent what's called a Section 106 review, a federal historic preservation review under the National Historic Preservation Act. When that review process was underway and going through the process, that process allows for organizations to become consulting parties to that review process. Ms. Chappell and her organization, Voices, became a consulting party to that review process, a signatory to that review process. So that organization, and Ms. Chappell in particular, had access to a lot of information on the construction process, historic studies, design work as it was going through the process. As when we held open houses, those were to gather ideas. That we didn't have all the answers at those early open houses. And when the National Park Service, as the responsible government unit, had open houses, that was also early in the design process. So I just want to make it clear that there was a lot of information available throughout the process, and the Voices group has had a lot of conversations with the State Historic Preservation Office, with the National Park Service, with our staff at the Minnesota Historical Society, to answer questions about the construction project as it has gone through the design and construction phase. So the lines of communication have been open, they continue to be open, and we're happy to answer questions about what's going on.
Thank you, Mr. Kelleher. Ms. Chappell, I think you've told me before your information at finding out how to get there. You had an expectation when you went to the Minnesota Historical Society that that is where you would just go directly and get information. How did you become a signatory? That's kind of a pretty high level connection with on a federal thing. How did that even happen?
Because I was refused information from the Minnesota Historical Society, I had to research and go through the paperwork to figure out how to develop a group called Voices. And it was only then that I did develop the group, because I couldn't get the information from the Historical Society. It was only after realizing that there was a way to get information about what was going on at Fort Snelling that I was able to get the information, because the doors had been closed to me from the Historical Society, and I wasn't able to get it from them. So I went through the process, and it was somewhat involved and took a few months to get that information too. And then I was approved and made signatory for the group. It was time consuming, and I feel that still Voices has been unable to gain information from the Historical Society. During that process, there have been issues that have come up within the 106 process, and as David said, there is a process to go through for that. And one item that comes to mind is what they call a undiscovered. I'm sorry, the terminology is very foreign to me, and I'm still trying to learn it within the federal process. But there was a discovery made, and it had to do with archaeology. And we did not receive, we meaning the Voices group, did not receive notification of the discovery. And we were concerned that that archaeological find was not being handled in an appropriate manner. We filed a concern, and it was not addressed in a manner that we had felt would be appropriate. And at this point, I think there is a picture of the find in there. It is a post from the original porches, which were on the barracks there were two buildings of 1904 Cavalry Barracks, and one has been removed from design. So they were going to put the porch on, which is was popular at the time at Fort Snelling, and it no longer is there. In designs, it was removed by the Historical Society, and there were instances and concerns by SHPO to put that back, And there were discussions to not put it back by reason, brought up by a coalition that did not feel it was mandated. And ultimately they gave way to that and did put it in with the funding and lack of funding claimed by the Historical Society. It was removed and then it was placed back in again, and designs currently that I'm aware of do not include that famous porch any longer. It is troublesome that a group can try to raise insight into the problems and not be answered. And for the historic purposes of that, and then further for the Historical Society to not respond and want to preserve that type of history just based on look and appearance, and dig up and find these relics and not want to preserve them in the manner that they need to be preserved, causes some concern that there needs to be a manner and method of preservation and protection that is not being followed under any type of protocol. And that's concerning, and something that the state could step in and really help guide that process and open the communications more.
Thank you, Ms. Chappell. I think one of the things that I've become aware over this period of time is the very distinct difference between the legal structure of a nonprofit and a state agency. Since SHPO was actually moved from the Minnesota Historical Society over quite a bit of contention and problems and issues. And so it was moved over to the Department of Administration, SHPO itself was. And I was part of that. There was part of legislation at that time. There was always the conversation that should there be more of the State Historic Preservation Office be in that state agency. But at the time, I wasn't really aware of the fact that that this nonprofit status gave rights of privacy, didn't include then state laws of freedom of information requests, because it's a nonprofit, not a state agency. And that is why when you have SHPO, which is now moved over into admin, Ms. Chappell could get information there. But had that not been moved, that may not have been the case. And so I've seen the particular benefit that comes from, especially when you have state assets like this, and many times state funding. As a matter of fact, we did include the funding for that as well. But I thought it would be just really valuable for the committee to hear a little bit more. I'm going to give another opportunity for you, Mr. Whitworth, if you would like to make additional comment at this time.
Thank you, Chair Kiffmeyer, members of the committee. What I would say is that we have worked closely. I would reinforce what David Kelleher had said, particularly on the Fort Snelling project. We have worked very closely with the National Park Service and with the State Historic Preservation Office, and have complied with all of the processes and the procedures. I was not here when some of those decisions regarding the porch on Building 18 were made, but I'm sure my colleague David Kelleher can elaborate on the process and the decisions that have been made. I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Whitworth. And Mr. Whitworth, you and I, over, I would say about the past 5 years, there have been a lot of controversy with Fort Snelling, a lot of controversy. This has been an occasion for meetings with myself, with other senators, even some board members and others as well that have expressed some concerns. And this has been going on for a little while now. And probably one of the biggest things that I realized, though, is that much of this when you're a nonprofit, there are certain things you do have to comply with, which in regards you talk about on some of those. But there are also things that you have as a nonprofit, in particular, the workings of the Historical Society in general. I worked in Sherburne County on a capital campaign on a private nonprofit in Sherburne County Historical Society. And then after we'd raised about, I think, $1.2 million, the county and the Historical Society which was at that time, it became part of the county ownership, and there was land donated as well. But it gave clear path in regards to the county and doing it. Of course, it didn't hurt the county to have $1.2 million of private money raised to help in regards to the work that was done there. So I think you know my history. Yes, Mr. Whitworth, before you and before others and so on and so forth. Life moves on, and history we are making today. History is not just the past, but today will be the past one day and then 2 days and whatever. And that's why we have recordings that we have as we do our work here in the legislature and to make it publicly accessible. That is not the case when you have a nonprofit. It's a very, very different kind of structure. And I think when you have circumstances like these, the access to the data that is really very important to all Minnesotans in a variety of degrees and ways. Some have a real particular interest. It's just in their nature to do so. And I think that access to those records and having those things are really important. And so I feel like when I've seen this, and especially some of the many controversies, and then the access to data is what is there today. But I know that we can continue to have this conversation. Mr. Whitworth, you're welcome to contact me, and you also, Mr. Kelleher, and anybody else who has a concern about this issue, feel free to do so. It doesn't have to be just through this conference committee meeting that we're having today. Mr. Whitworth, you look like you'd like to say something else.
Chair
Mr.
Kiffmeyer, members of the conference committee, yes. First of all, thank you for your work on behalf of your county historical society. You referenced 1.2 million raised from the private sector for that project. And I'm pleased to remind everyone that the Minnesota Historical Society was able to bring, through the generosity of private sector donors, $15 million to the historic Fort Snelling revitalization project. So yes, two great examples of public-private partnerships. And we work each day with researchers everywhere from middle school students working on a History Day project to postdoctoral fellows. And we now are back in the library, I'm pleased to say, the Gale Family Library. We also are delivering research services virtually, more effectively and more broadly than in the pre-pandemic days. So we understand exactly what it is to work with people who have that history gene, who are very curious and are interested and are proud of the service we're able to deliver to thousands of researchers day in each year. So what we're hearing today is certainly the exception to our experience day in and day out, is as we interact with the people of Minnesota and far beyond. So thank you, Chair Kiffmeyer.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Whitworth. And yes, there have been many cases that in my life of working specifically converting the original land survey records from paper to digital versions, sharing those copies, and also being used in a court case to resolve a Torrens dispute, which is ownership of land all the way dating back to Minnesota's statehood. And so there are others, by the way, Mr. Whitworth, who have had these kinds of conversations with me. They are concerned about speaking publicly. Ms. Chappell has requested that she have this opportunity today to be able to speak this, but to let you know, this is not about just her. There are many others who share this concern, but they're not always wanting to put themselves out in a public sort of way. And I appreciate Ms. Chappell being here today and representing, as she calls her group, the Voices. She is the one who is publicly being the face of that. But I assure you, this is not just her and not even just that small group. And so I think this is something that I've dealt with, as I said, for a number of years. And I think once I connected the dots to the nonprofit status and that the state of Minnesota did not have that. It doesn't have to be always the managing, but at least in the ownership, and then all the laws that come along with that as a state property, I think is a very important consideration. And there are a lot of laws that come into play when you have that structure, that legal structure. So that's what is motivating me, and I'm straight up and telling folks about it. No question. I believe in having that. So I appreciate everybody and your taking of your time here today. Does anybody else have a question or anything else that they'd like to bring up in regards to SHPO at this time?
Madam Chair, I've had my hand raised.
Representative Greenman, I was looking for a hand in your box. You know, that
Oh,
sometimes.
sorry, I've had my hand in the box, but I also
Yeah.
know.
No. But then I have the participants list up to the side and I see your hand there. And my apologies, I just didn't glance there. Representative Greenman, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I know in this Zoom world, it is hard to manage all the boxes. And I really appreciate as somebody who, everybody has their own story about connection to the Historical Society, and as a history nerd who did History Day when I was a kid, and now has the privilege of representing Fort Snelling at Bodote, I am just really grateful for all the ways that the Historical Society and frankly the wisdom of the territorial legislature in 1849, deciding that this is a really critical piece of our state, even before we were a statehood. And so one of the things I'm interested in is, I think, and you know, as somebody who studied history, and I know a lot of folks probably have, there's lots of voices over long periods of time, and Minnesota is no different and has a really complex and rich history. I'm wondering, given our the unique relationship of the Historical Society, and what I didn't know, but when I came to the legislature, I looked, is that the Historical Society, unlike other nonprofits, is mentioned 119 times in our statute. And so it has this unique relationship, I think, similarly to the University of Minnesota that also was chartered before we became a state. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that relationship, the state, and I think you talked about it as public-private partnership, allows you to engage stakeholders, not just the government, but private stakeholders, communities, local communities across the state, tribal nations, sort of folks who live on the land and folks who have ancestors who live on the land. I'm wondering if you could talk about that process of engagement. Thank you,
Representative Greenman, are you asking Mr. Whitworth?
Mr. Whitworth or Mr. Kelleher? Thank you.
Sure, it sounded like you were.
Thank you, Mr. or Madam.
Looks like Mr. Whitworth is coming unmuted here, so an indication that he'd like to address this question. So go ahead, Mr. Whitworth.
Chair Kiffmeyer, Representative Greenman, thank you. Interestingly, I've been in the field for 30 years, and there are many different models as to how that state history function is structured. And the arrangement, that public-private partnership that's reflected in the arrangement in Minnesota is frankly viewed as sort of the best of both worlds. To your point, Representative Greenman, we have the opportunity to bring public sector support. And as I said, Fort Snelling's a perfect example, a $34.5 million capital project, and the state provided in several allocations $19.5 million. but the private sector brought $15 million to the table and nearly doubled the scope of what we were able to accomplish through that capital project. That would not have been possible except for this public-private relationship. And so, as I said, it has been viewed across our field for a number of years as really the most effective way to fulfill this work, where you don't put the entire burden on the public sector, nor do you put the entire burden on the private sector. And that's why it's wonderful that this is codified in state statutes so many different places. So it feels like there are checks and balances, and we are always willing to continue the conversation with members of the legislature, private sector partners like local historical societies and other groups. So we're very committed to continuous improvement and welcome the opportunity to have these kinds of conversations. But frankly, this has worked very well in Minnesota, and others across the country have either aspired to or followed this model because of its effectiveness in this state.
Thank you, Mr. Whitworth. Representative Greenman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. How long have we been, Mr. Whitworth or Mr. Kelleher, how long have we been sort of managing and operating historic sites this way and with this partnership?
Mr. Whitworth.
Madam Chair, Representative Greenman, we have been managing historic sites at the Minnesota Historical Society for more than 50 years.
Representative Greenman, that's 50 years, not 151, though.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm wondering what was happening, how is that happening before that? How were historic sites designated and operated?
Mr. Whitworth.
Madam Chair, Representative Greenman, as my colleague David Kelleher mentioned earlier, these sites came to the Minnesota Historical Society in several different ways. And in some cases, we were deeded those, were gifted those properties. In several cases, we purchased them. And in other cases, they came directly to the state or the state purchased them. So I'll turn to my colleague to see if he wants to elaborate on that.
Mr. Kelleher.
Madam Chair, Representative Greenman, we use the figure 50 years because really in the late 50s, 1960s, and into the 1970s was when this network began to develop. And in the mid 1960s was when the federal government passed the National Historic Preservation Act. And that's when the field of historic preservation really started to develop and become part of our federal structure. And as has been referenced before, the state historic preservation offices are a federal state partnership, and the federal government provides money for that to happen. So there was a larger movement to preserve historic structures. And there were a couple of cases where the public said, these historic locations were in jeopardy and they needed to be preserved. And there were a couple of cases where they were lost, and those lost opportunities were lost forever. And Fort Snelling is one of those examples. In the 1950s, there was a proposal to do a cloverleaf around the Round Tower. And that was federal land. The whole area was federal land. And there was already a movement to transfer a lot of that land to the state of Minnesota from the federal government because it was decommissioned as a fort in 1946. Then Governor Orville Freeman got a call from Kent's predecessor, the director of the Historical Society, who said that you can't do that. You can't have the highway do a cloverleaf around the Round Tower because that's one of the most iconic places in Minnesota. And that led to a lot of archaeological studies and the redevelopment of that as a place where people could come to visit. So it was a gradual process of the Minnesota Historical Society, Mr. Fridley, the director, worked very closely with the legislature to develop the network and to do studies that in some cases were funded by the then LCMR to develop criteria for bringing places into this network. So even back then in the 60s and 70s, it was a partnership between the Minnesota Historical Society and the state of Minnesota to develop this network and recognize the skills and talents that we could bring to the conversation with interpretation, preservation, archaeology, and other things. And while I'm speaking, I just wanted to go back to the issue of accessibility of information. And we hold information in collections, both three-dimensional objects and manuscripts and public records. We hold the state archives in partnership with the state of Minnesota. That's what we do. We're a library. We are dedicated to preserving and providing access to those resources. I think that there may be a few instances, and as Mr. Whitworth said, maybe the exception rather than the rule, but that's what we do. We provide access to information. We have an information policy that provides for openness of all of this information, and we're happy to see where we can do better, but we are dedicated to providing information to Minnesotans. That's our job.
Thank you, Mr. Kelleher. Representative Greenman, anything more?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would just say I appreciate the foresight in the 60s of them saving the historic Fort Snelling. And as again, I said, it is in my district. So if members want to come, I'm sure that they would take us on a tour to see the really amazing work that they're doing to restore and really create an experience for all Minnesotans and frankly, everyone across the country to come to that. So I'd love to if members want to come with me, I'd love that as well. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative Greenman. Appreciate that. I do think, though, that there are many folks, though, who do think that the Minnesota Historical Society is a state agency and that there is that pretty much universally and the difference that it makes. So when something is donated to the Historical Society, is not donated to the state of Minnesota. It is donated to a private nonprofit organization. And that is then who has the ownership. So when I reflect back on those original land survey records, my expectation is that I was donating, not I, but through my office, was giving over the original land survey documents, which were in possession and required to be there by through the Secretary of State office, that this would be going then to a state agency. I think that was my expectation. It didn't occur to me to check into that. And if that were the case, I would have seen to it that it would have gone, because these were state-owned records. They were state records of the state and should be with the state of Minnesota totally in their control. It doesn't mean that they cannot contract with somebody else for some of the things that need to be done. But I think there's a number of things like that I think are really important. By the way, members, the language in this from the Senate includes only the state-owned properties, not the mixed and not the ones that have federal or other such things, at least as that was the intention. So members, I think we've spent some good time here on this particular subject, which I thought was very important for us to take the time to do. And does anybody else have any questions or anything at all? Ms. Chappell, you'll have to unmute.
Yes, thank you. And there is quite a interminglement or intertwined relationship. One item that I'm aware of is the Sibley Historic Site, perhaps one of the oldest that we have the richness to share. And when the Daughters of the American Revolution had operated that for so long and donated that to the Historical Society, the buildings are with the state. However, the contents are with the Historical Society. So it's really a joint effort in the future, and to make sure that the interpretation is somewhat lost if the Historical Society were to lose the rights to the building. So it is a win-win situation for the state to manage the site and in turn allow the Historical Society to operate it as a historical society, as a historic site for tourism with the state of Minnesota. That's one example that I can think of off the top of my head that is really a collaborative effort and lends itself to that under the guiding principle that it is a partnership and it will remain so. And I think to your knowledge, Senator Kiffmeyer, when you're donating something, it is not going to the state, and it really is going to a nonprofit. And a lot of people don't understand that, and hopefully that will get more clarity and clarified between both the Historical Society and the state, so people are aware of how entangled the situation is, and that the two groups can come together and really work on this in a partnership. And thank you to everyone for your time today in addressing this. I do appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. Chappell. Members, are there any other subjects? Chair Nelson, do you have something in regards to?
Madam Chair, I just want to point out that Representative Zhang and Representative Mason have their hands up. I don't know why I can see them.
Thank you for helping me. I missed it.
I can see them on my screen. I don't know why you can't, but that's anyway. Representative Zhang and then Representative Mason have their hands up.
Okay, I'll call on each of them. Representative Zhang, and then we'll go with Representative Mason. Thank you, Chair Nelson.
Thank you, Chair Nelson. I think I had a question, might be for Ms. Chappell. I wanted to ask, who or what the voices group that the testifier was referring to might be. Is it 501(c) organizations or a group of neighbors?
It's a group of neighbors, and we are dedicated to seeing that veterans, the disabled, and policy is followed at Fort Snelling.
Okay. Thank you.
Representative Zhang, thank you. Representative Mason.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to make a couple of comments. Item one, and I probably shouldn't admit this, I'm not native to Minnesota. But for as long as I have lived in Minnesota, I have always known the Historical Society predates the state. And that to me gives it a real special significance. And so, and I'm thinking again, when people are donating, they know that they are donating it to the Historical Society. I mean, how many options would people be doing just to give it to the state? I mean, I still remember when the Historical Society used to be next to the Capitol. And again, to me, that was saying how important the Historical Society is to the history of Minnesota. And that's what we rely on. So that's my point. And I'm from Ohio. I have no idea what Ohio does, but I've always known the Historical Society is important to Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Mason. We appreciate that. And by the way, in regards to some of these things, that it is important, and there are certain things that the legal structure affects things a little bit more than maybe, and also there have been some controversies about the interpretive and as well, that we have a little history. Mr. Whitworth, you've unmuted. Did you want to make a comment?
Chair Kiffmeyer, Representative Mason, I just was going to clarify that the Ohio History Connection, formerly known as the Ohio Historical Society, is a nonprofit and is another example of a large Midwestern state that has benefited for generations in this hybrid public-private partnership model. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Whitworth.
Thank you.
Mr. Whitworth, I don't think you're a native Minnesotan either. I think you have transplanted yourself from another state. Mr.
Chair
Whitworth?
Kiffmeyer, I'm a seventh generation Kentuckian, but I am proud to report that my mother was a third generation Minnesotan. And so I spent many a summer at Bay Lake near Brainerd, and I have many a childhood photos from the Round Tower at Fort Snelling. So no, I'm not a native of Minnesota, but my roots here are deep.
Mhm. Thank you, Mr. Whitworth. I think there are a lot of people here in Minnesota, legislators and otherwise, who may have those kinds of things. And then you come to Minnesota, or you have deeper family connections, as many of us have those as well. And so we appreciate that. But I know you and I have had good conversations about your mother, and then also about Kentucky as well. We appreciate all of our states. Matter of fact, if you go to any national things sometimes, I see now a hand up for Representative Tujong. And is that just left over from before, or did you have something else, Representative Tujong?
Mom, it's just left over. I'll put it down.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, members, are there any other topics that anybody, well, I'll just go to you. Chair Nelson, since it is about 10:30, I know it's fishing opener. We want to maybe let folks get back out there, but did you want to make any other comments before we adjourn?
Thank you, Madam Chair. No, I was just going to say we're planning on meeting Monday. We're looking at Senator Kiffmeyer and I had some discussions last night about to try and lighten our load, what looks like going to be a special session to possibly pass out some of the policy stuff we've agreed upon. So we may, if we come to an agreement on that, we may be bringing that up Monday to pass a conference committee report with policy only provisions in it. Otherwise, like I said, look forward to the notice for Monday's meeting. Hopefully tomorrow we can all have a day of rest and recovery. Madam Chair, I see that Representative Nash has his hand up. He has a question.
Okay, Representative Nash, thank you for the help in catching those hands raised. Representative Nash.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Just wanted to go back to the conversation about yesterday. I was remiss in reminding everybody, or may have forgotten at the time, that the rationale behind the raffle tickets being with a debit card is because gambling cannot be paid for with a credit card by law. And that's why it has to be a cash only, thus a debit card. So am still quite hopeful that we can move that provision forward, because again, even though we've gratefully lifted the mask mandate, never know what is going to happen when the governor still retains his executive powers, and would very much like to be able to enable these folks to be able to do these in a safe manner and in compliance with the law around gambling, utilizing cash only, not a credit card.
Thank you, Representative Nash, for that additional information. I appreciate that. Okay, members, with that, we have no other business before us today. Please stay tuned, and also to let you know that the leadership is having conversations about how to proceed after our last day of session at midnight. We do not know what that may take, but from what I've heard from both leadership and both bodies is that we'll continue to do our work. So Representative Nelson will be getting to know each other even better in the coming days. It's always a little fun to have a little conversation as we have to also do our work. Okay. With that, members, we are adjourned for today. Thank you very much.